Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I know we've been having a lot of events on nuclear security and the recent conflict with India. So it is a very important discussion, but I understand that it's also been a very overwhelming discussion to have so frequently. Thank you for coming for this edition of ORF's National Security Dialogue. Today's session is titled Strategic Shifts India's Nuclear Security in the Evolving Global Landscape. As we know, with growing tensions amongst the great powers, with emerging technology redefining warfare, nuclear security is more dynamic than it has been in decades. Today's discussion, we hope to examine how India can navigate this complex terrain while also safeguarding its national interests, maintaining stability within its neighbors and in South Asia, and contributing meaningfully to the global nuclear order. We have four speakers today, as you can see, starting with Dr. Manpreet Sethi, who is Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies, New Delhi. She heads its program on nuclear issues. She's also a Senior Research Advisor for the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, and since having received her doctorate in 1997, has worked on nuclear energy, strategy, missile defense, arms control, nuclear risk reduction, and disarmament. We also have Dr. Shivani Singh joining us online. She is a postdoctoral researcher in the Third Nuclear Age project at the University of Leicester, UK. Her expertise spans on nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, radiological and nuclear security, and complex dynamics of the global South countries within the global nuclear order, again focusing on South Asia. We also have our in-house expert, Karthik Bomakanti, who is a senior fellow at the Strategic Studies program here at ORF. He specializes in space military issues, and his research primarily focuses on the Indo-Pacific region. He also works in emerging technologies and nuclear conventional and subconventional coercion. We finally have Dr. Hina Pandey, who is an independent policy analyst, having demonstrated her policy research expertise focusing on nuclear issues, non-proliferation issues, security, energy politics, and the US-India foreign policy issues. She is also an honorary fellow with the Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping rules. We will be recording the session and it will be available online, so you can refer to it later. We will also have a moderated Q&A after all of the panelists have given their comments. So if you have any questions, please reserve them for the Q&A session, and then we can collectively discuss that. We will also have high tea after the event. So in case your question doesn't get the opportunity to be asked in the recorded session, you can ask it later during the high tea session. With that, let's begin with Dr. Sethi. Dr. Sethi, I would like to ask for your comments on India's no first use policy, and especially in the face of new threats. Does it offer any strategic value? And if so, what are the strategic values of the no first use policy?
Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. And I don't think when Shravishta had planned this event, it was going to be in this backdrop. So the issues have become, very relevant once again. And I'm happy to be given this opportunity to speak a little bit about how I am looking at India's nuclear strategy, particularly in the context of no first use. So as you all realize, this month, just a few days ago, we've completed 27 years as a state with nuclear weapons. And if you look at the doctrine that we gave us in the form of a note that came from the Cabinet Committee on Security, which came to be known as India's nuclear doctrine, it is just a 1.5-page document available easily on the MEA website. And basically, this document goes back to 2003. So 22 years old now. And what were the main points of this doctrine? We gave to ourselves the role of the nuclear weapon being not to be subjected to nuclear blackmail or coercion, to safeguard ourselves against such a possibility. And there were three important doctrinal attributes that came out. One was credible minimum deterrence. The second was no first use. And the third one was that since we will not be the first to use, if there is nuclear use against India, it would retaliate to cause unacceptable damage, which in loose language we've started calling as massive retaliation. Now, the question that Shravishta has posed to me is, how resilient is India's no first use in the face of new threats? So when we acquired nuclear weapons, our threats were Pakistan and China. our threats continue to remain the same. But what is new about this threat is that we've got Pakistan with a growing nuclear capability. Pakistan started with the idea of credible minimum deterrence, much like we did, but it has graduated from there to what it now calls full spectrum deterrence, which is to be able to deter at every level. So you build your capability to be able to deter India at every level of the spectrum. So that's full spectrum deterrence, while it continues to do terrorism. And that is really the challenge that India is facing. And in the case of China, we are finding China, which is expanding its capability at the nuclear level. So there are numbers which are increasing, and there is modernization in terms of capability build-up. So the technologies that it is bringing in are quite different, which sometimes raises question marks on its commitment to the declared doctrine, which also, like the case of India, was no first use. It is no first use as far as their white paper is concerned. So these are the two new challenges that, I mean, if you could define them as new in a certain sense, but that's what we are looking at. So if we start with the first challenge, which is of Pakistan, and really here it's not Pakistan's nuclear capability which is a challenge, it's Pakistan's nuclear strategy. And it's a brilliant strategy, really, where they try to compress the space for conventional war with India by suggesting that the moment you do a response of any kind, the moment you mount a conventional strike against us, we are going to go nuclear. So we have no space to fight a conventional war, and therefore nuclear is going to be our answer. And while they will continue with their acts of terror, so bleeding India through 1,000 cuts continues to remain Pakistan's, relationship with India. And in that, then they like to show brinksmanship. And the idea of brinksmanship, where they try to compress that space, they have gone on refining it. So, it started by saying, we have these thresholds. The moment you do anything like this, nuclear weapons are going to be used. They then compressed it to include the idea of tactical nuclear weapons. So this meant that against battlefield targets, they'll be able to use what they call low-yield nuclear weapons. And once they tested a short-range ballistic missile, they started bringing in the idea of TNWs. And very recently, just a couple of years ago, when they completed 25 years as a state with nuclear weapons, Mr. Khalid Kidwai, who was the head of their strategic plans division for 14 years and is even today an advisor to the SPD, he came up with the idea of 0-kilometer range nuclear weapons, which essentially then when he was questioned, what does this mean? The answers that came from the Pakistani strategic community itself was it could be like landmines or artillery shells with nuclear weapons. So that's how he's compressing the space and trying to exercise his strategy. So the challenge then for India is, how do you deter terrorism? It's not about being able to fight at the conventional level. It is about fighting at the conventional space in order to deter terrorism. How do you punish Pakistani behavior? How do you execute your conventional operations in such a way that the nuclear weapons are redundant? Because his strategy is to constantly push nuclear weapons under your nose. Even now in this crisis, as you would have noticed, the railway minister of Pakistan was the first one to say, that if India does anything, we have nuclear weapons. Then the defense minister made that statement. They tested two missiles while the crisis was on. All of this was a way of brinksmanship, again, trying to compress that space. So how do you then obviate the risk of nuclear escalation? And really what we are seeing in front of us is a real life example of how you're going to do all of this. Because what India has managed to show is that when you do conventional action with a calibrated use of force against targets, which have been clearly defined, then you are not touching the red lines of Pakistan, even if they have been very vaguely articulated. But you're staying far away from that and you're able to push that punishment on Pakistan. Now, besides our instruments and technology, which has given us this capability to execute operations in such a manner, the other important thing which is giving us this space is India's no first use. Because if India also had a first use doctrine, you would be putting the adversary in a panicking mode to suggest that, if you don't use it, we are going to use first, and that will take away your ability to use that weapon against us more effectively than otherwise. So, by putting the onus of escalation on the adversary, by suggesting a no first use doctrine, India is liberating the adversary from that fear of use or lose. You are liberating yourself from the requirement of an arsenal which has to be credible for first use, which means large numbers, which means highly accurate missiles, which means having a damage limitation capability. So, we've liberated ourselves from all of this. And what we are suggesting to the other side is you try to use the weapon against us, there's going to be hell to pay for an act of that nature. So I think NFU has also given us that space to be able to answer the challenges that we are posing. Secondly, the challenge from China. And here we are facing the problem of China's nuclear capability. Like Pakistan, it was nuclear strategy. In this case, it's nuclear capability because he is building his conventional and his nuclear capability to be able to give teeth or give feet to his aggressive behavior. And to counter that, then, what does India do? If we feel that we could be overwhelmed at the conventional level, then several people have suggested that we should move from our no first use to first use, because that's how you would be able to deter him better. And I find that not a very sound strategy, because really, would first use make sense when the adversary has a secure second strike capability? What kind of a first use would you do where you would be able to minimize the retaliation from that side? And with China's expanding numbers, dispersal of missiles and all, and how he's positioning himself, that is not going to be possible. So our response to China has to come at the conventional level through the dime spectrum. I think Pakistan is going to make this realization as well. Because however much you might like to express yourself with a first use strategy, if we don't believe Pakistan's first use to be credible, why would China believe our first use to be credible? So the answer for us lies to stick with the no first use, focus on the survivability of your no first use, so that if there is any use of nuclear weapons, your signal is that you will still be able to cause unacceptable damage or massive retaliation to the other side. But really, the conflict has to be fought at the conventional level. Up till now, with China, we fought with clubs and with sticks. But between clubs and sticks and nuclear weapons, there's this whole space of conventional domain. And we have to really be making ourselves strong in that domain to be able to stand up to China and deter China with the kind of challenges that we are facing. So I find the NFU still resilient and relevant, even with the kind of newer sets of challenges that are beginning to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sethi. As always, you have very revolutionary ideas into this space. I would like to turn to Dr. Shivani Singh now, who's joining us online. Dr. Singh, you've been working on a project called the Third Nuclear Age. To begin with, first, it would be great if you could introduce the concept of a third nuclear age to the audience, and then go on to include how India's nuclear posture fits into this, especially considering how Dr. Sethi just mentioned, we finished 27 years of having nuclear weapons, so we might not be on the same timeline as the global north when it comes to the third nuclear age.
First of all, thank you to ORF for organizing this event. I do apologize for not being there in person, but it's great to also share the dais with Dr. Sethi, Dr. Hina Pandey, and Karthik. The question that you posed on the third nuclear age, I think it's important to sort of first try and understand what is this new nuclear age, and if also question if we are even in a new nuclear age. So the way the new age is defined is it's sort of marked by certain significant trends that you can sort of map out. Three broad trends to be specific. The first is the return of great power competition, the great power politics. The second is emergence of smaller nuclear powers. And the third, which is, I think, the most important in terms of, in the context of this discussion, is the introduction of destabilizing emerging technologies. And we all know, as far as the third angle is concerned, it includes everything from, you have your anti-submarine warfare, national ballistic missile defense, autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. Also to include, obviously, cyber warfare, which can threaten a state's both conventional and military, as well as nuclear establishments, including both civilian and military nuclear facilities, and also target a state's command and control systems, right? But since you asked me, in terms of theoretically, if you have to sort of look at this new nuclear age, doctrinally speaking, in terms of India's nuclear posture of counter-value nuclear strikes, the no first use posture and the credible minimum deterrence principle that Dr. Sethi very eloquently described, one can sort of expect an impact on some of these notions and concepts that sort of undergird a state's nuclear posture, and not only India's, but all nuclear weapon states in general, in terms of an impact on the concept of deterrence and also deterrence thresholds, especially during Operation Sindoor. What we saw was use of high-tech drones, electronic warfare, jamming, and supposed spoofing. We don't know that yet, as well as employment of homegrown missile defense systems. And as a result of that, what many experts have sort of argued is that both these states have sort of climbed up the escalation ladder to a certain extent. And what one is witnessing today is sort of a growing entanglement of both nuclear and strategic non-nuclear weapon systems. What this essentially means is that, especially when it comes to strategic non-nuclear weapon systems, they can serve as a sort of a front to distract the adversary and sort of keep it engaged, either through, cyber warfare or information warfare, and sort of then follow that up with either a limited conventional strike or, God forbid, a limited nuclear strike. So there will be also special challenges as far as crisis management measures are also concerned, for countries like India and Pakistan, as well as India and China, which are, in such close geographical proximity with each other. So in such circumstances, I think the biggest challenge for India, and as Dr. Sethi also elaborated, would be to maintain India's no first use posture and its policy of credible minimum deterrence, and to sort of not, fall prey to this tit for tat in terms of weapons advancements, because we know that will ultimately lead to an arms race on the subcontinent, which most likely will potentially sort of spiral out of control. Just very quickly, the second aspect of the third nuclear age, which is the great power competition, that is also important to understand, because what we're witnessing today is sort of a move towards nuclear multipolarity. And when we talk about nuclear multipolarity, this is not the same as the kind of nuclear proliferation of new nuclear actors that was witnessed during the second nuclear age. What is happening in this new nuclear age is, there are multiple poles of nuclear power and dominance, which is sort of shifting towards multiple actors and away from a sort of a bipolar or unipolar system, wherein these new nuclear actors have influence in shaping the very contours of the global nuclear order as we know it. So what we're seeing today is a certain reconfiguration of alliances, which I think can serve as a good opportunity for India to sort of further its position in the nuclear order. And when we talk about, the nuclear order per se, but also the nuclear non-proliferation regime, another trend that you're witnessing is a certain sort of a relaxation or loosening of this nuclear non-proliferation apparatus, in the sense that there is a greater tendency and willingness by the great powers like US to better accommodate a lot of rising nuclear powers like India. And a notable example of this, a lot of us must have come across the US announcement earlier this year to remove curbs on 3 of India's nuclear entities, including the Bhabha Atomic Research Center. And this is to obviously with the aim to further boost civil nuclear cooperation between the two countries, and also more importantly, providing a push to the 2008 civil nuclear agreement. So I think India can very well leverage its unique position, um, both geopolitical and economic, to sort of play off the nuclear powers to extract benefits for itself. And this is not necessarily from the point of view of the non-alignment strategy, which a lot of experts have over the years sort of pointed to the limitations attached to the non-alignment strategy in terms of India achieving its foreign policy and some of its strategic objectives. But instead, what we're seeing is India increasingly adopting a multi-alignment strategy. And the way I sort of understand the strategy is, the way I understand the multi-alignment strategy is essentially bringing about a balance engagement with, by India with the great powers to sort of meet its own objectives, and also in the process exercise its own freedom of action and strategic instrumentality. And that, I think, will be extremely important for an actor like India going into this rapidly evolving strategic landscape. I think I'll stop here, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singh. I'd like to now turn to Karthik. The two previous speakers have brought up China and Pakistan and India's general neighborhood pretty significantly when it comes to India's nuclear posturing. How do you think India should navigate the strategic competition with its neighborhood while avoiding escalation traps and focus particularly on its regional environment where conventional thresholds are also getting increasingly blurred?
Thank you, Dr. Sethi, and thank you, Shivani, and thank you, Dr. Hina. I'll restrict myself to two things. See, when you say that because conventional and nuclear capabilities and their use, or rather their postures, are becoming increasingly blurred, you see the problem is that fundamentally, when it comes to China, it's going to be more challenging for India simply because if they commingle capabilities, then you will be actually deterred from attacking. Now, if they're going to have nuclear and conventional forces at land, on their land-based facilities, in silos that have both atomic and conventional capabilities, you're not going to be able to strike them. It could lead to mischaracterization. And that is fundamental to the larger quest to render most of China's nuclear posture as ambiguous as possible so that it deters adversaries. Of course, it's not exclusively geared at India. I mean, it's also as much geared at the Americans. But the point I'm trying to make is that it certainly does fetter or at least limit and induces caution in countries like India. The point about when you say beyond that, when it comes to Pakistan, I think the problems are not that demanding. But I think where the problems start to arise with Pakistan is that you just don't know what his threshold for nuclear use is, because being far more vulnerable to strategic interdiction, it's bound to have a greater incentive to use its nuclear weapons. That I do agree with. But you have to remember the fact that even if it did use it's certainly, as Dr. Sethi has pointed out, the retribution from India is going to be so massive that it just makes no sense for them to do so. But given the idiosyncratic and the acute and visceral sense of threat that they face, they're bound to use it. They could use it very well. So I think the vulnerability is really there if you look at it with actual nuclear use. With China, I think the possibility is a little more remote, but it does create enough constraints on India to actually use use force, even conventional capabilities. Even if you were to create, long-range cruise missile capabilities that are capable of striking deep inside Chinese territory, it does require that India have. Uh, it does require that India be cautious. But I would say that regardless of what the Pakistanis are doing, we must pay attention to what the Chinese are doing. They're certainly going to improve their BMD capabilities. They're capable of, intercepting our intermediate range Agni missiles through the HQ-19 ballistic missile defense system. They've also developed hypersonic weapons. And these are things that we have to take very, very seriously. And they have other vectors of attack. They have their own H-6 bombers, which can deliver ALBMs, that is air-launched ballistic missiles. They can deliver even ALCMs. So those are things that we've got to pay close attention to. So they could be nuclear armed or conventionally armed. So this is something that India has to be very, very concerned about. And we don't have the kind of geographic depth that China has. Pakistan, as I said, is vulnerable to strategic interdiction from India. But India is very vulnerable to strategic interdiction from China because its landmass is much smaller. So my point is, India will have to try and do what it can to actually distribute its capabilities on its sea leg, mostly, and it will need more robust BMD capabilities, and it will also need hypersonics, which it has tested. There's one test we've conducted in November, but that'll have to improve, and we'll have to miniaturize better. We'll have to reduce weight to make it more attractive to some of the services, especially the IAF, to deploy and use. But generally, I would say that the sea leg will have to be much stronger. In terms of numbers, it need not be that long. I mean, we might not need very large numbers, but it will have to be more than what we have right now. Because if you're going to take on a dual threat from China and Pakistan, then it's best to have that reserve in place. And because we are pursuing a no NFU, then it makes it more imperative to have a slightly larger arsenal. But the premium has to be on delivery capabilities and on counter space systems. That includes microwaves, microwave weapons, laser systems deployed in space, in orbit with satellites. That's something that we need. For that, we need even space situational satellites for space situational awareness, data sensor capabilities in space. And we will need, apart from some of the points that Dr. Singh mentioned about, EW and CW, which will apply even to the space domain and will apply to the space nuclear link, because spaceborne capabilities will be so crucial for nuclear use. And I do believe with following Operation Sindoor, I think the collusion between China and Pakistan is likely to get deeper. They're already locked into their Baidu system. Their sat-nav capabilities, their satellite navigation system, the Chinese satellite navigation system. They have a whole range of long-range tracking radars that the Chinese have given them, phased array radars, so they can target pretty much every part of the Indian landmass, the Pakistanis can, and also all our offshore islands, including Andaman and Nicobar. So I think those things India has to be very, very mindful about. But one point about NFU that Dr. Sethi made was, I think it matters that we retain it. But one reason why we haven't relaxed it or given it up and migrated to an FU policy, that is a first use, or created some ambiguity about usage around that, at least from a doctrinal standpoint, is that it could lead to preemption. This is where you have to be very, very careful. And it ties back into the earlier point I mentioned about, the way the Pakistani state itself, given its acute sense of vulnerability, it may end up doing things that lead to nuclear use preemptively. So it's best not to, exacerbate that by, relaxing our own NFU. With China, I think when you look at NFU, the Chinese themselves, I believe, although they have a declared NFU, in certain circumstances, they may relax it. If they feel that they are losing, if their conventional forces are suffering heavy attrition, they may relax it. That is something that they've said privately to a lot of American interlocutors, from what I gather. I haven't heard it specifically from Chinese themselves, but it is known to the Americans that in certain circumstances they may do it, but it would have to be very extreme. That they would have to be losing a conventional war to relax their NFU and go into. Now, last point I wanted to make regarding what you said, one of your questions was one point about escalation traps. See, this thing can be a little misleading. I mean, what do we mean by escalation traps? As the Pakistanis mount an aggression like what they did at Kargil in 1999, India has to escalate. There is simply no choice, at least vertically, if not horizontally. We will have to use force with extreme force to evict the presence of those people occupying the Pakistani forces occupying our territory. Now, we may escalate even horizontally. We may cut across the LOC, or we may go across the border. We don't know. We may even resort to more airstrikes like what we did with Operation Sindoor, and not mount a land incursion while keeping our land operations confined to that discrete geographic zone as we did in Kargil. But you must remember, if the other side mounts aggression, carries out an act of aggression, then yes, there is no question of India escalating. Question is whether India can control it. In places like Kargil, we did manage to sustain high degree of escalation control. Pakistan could not counter-escalate, but we called Pakistan's bluff there, as we did with Sindoor as well at one level. But when it comes to mass casualty terrorism, like what we've had in Pahalgam and before that at Pulwama, I think our quest should be to stop and deter that. That will be the real test going forward from now onwards. Can we stop the Pakistanis based on what we did with airstrikes at Balakot, and then all those 9 strikes that we carried out against terror sites in Pakistan, and subsequent attacks against their air bases? If the losses that they've incurred and the pain that they've suffered serves as a restraint on subsequent terror attacks, then we would have achieved something. But that is still provisional. I don't know. I can't say that. I can't say definitively that they will stop mass terrorism. But the most that India can do and has done, it can do, is try and stop that sort of mass casualty terrorism. But I don't believe it can stop all forms of it. They infiltrate a few terrorists into India's side of the LOC in Kashmir. They killed a Jawan or an officer or somebody from the CRPF, or maybe a couple of civilians here or there. We are not going to be able to escalate like what we did with Sindoor. But mass casualty terrorism, there is a possibility that it may give the Pakistanis some pause. But let's see what happens in the coming months and years, whether they actually have internalized that or not. But I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Karthik. Dr. Pandey, the speakers before you have spoken about our dealings with China and Pakistan, how we're managing escalation and trying to deter future mass terrorism attacks, how we can deal with aligning with global powers in the future. What would your perspective be on non-proliferation, on how we can pursue and demonstrate India's commitment to that and also contribute to global norms?
Perfect. Thank you, Shravishta, and congrats to all my speakers who have really brilliantly set the stage. Good afternoon, everyone. So at the outset, I'd like to thank you, Shravishta, also for having me this opportunity to speak and share my views on non-proliferation, an issue and a subset which mostly gets ignored as well, because the strategy takes over, and strategy is the most glamorous bit of nuclear issues, right? So, yeah, you rightly, asked as to what is it that we can do in the realm of non-proliferation. And but before I start, I want to give a bit of disclaimer, which is that I speak to you in my individual and personal capacity. I'm representing as a visiting fellow of Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies, and my views cannot be attributed to the official government of India views, right? So, but let me begin by also breaking your question into 3 parts, right? So the way I understand the question is as to how does India really sits with the NPT, right? What is its unique relationship with because when you talk about non-proliferation, the first treaty as such that comes into our mind is the NPT, but we are outside of the NPT, right? The second, part of the question perhaps could be how we are contributing to its articles or to its larger objective of non-proliferation. And third is, what is it that we can still do? What is it that we can do more in this particular area? Now, before I begin to answer these three subsets, let me also share my comment or observation on the framing of the question itself, right? Because framing is so important, especially for India, which is outside of the non-proliferation regime, right? Not the regime, but the NPT. Now, when you say alternative pathway, of course, it's a very I think it's a correct way to suggest also, as to because we are outside, but sometimes an alternative pathway can also be interpreted as and it can also imply as something that is instead of, which is something else, and it could also imply different to what is usual. Now, those kind of narratives are probably very risky when we are trying to really up the profile of nuclear non-proliferation, and we are really doing good work so far this area is concerned. So, of course, I'm not saying you have to reframe the question, but my suggestion would be to also add another expression which is aligned. So we can always say how our I mean, how we are outside, how we can do alternate pathways, but at the same time, how we are also aligned to the larger goal of non-proliferation. That is one. Because the danger of misinterpretation is always there, and in the realm of nuclear, where a lot of it is also communications and minds and the perceptions. So this is quite important. So that is my first suggestion. And so, what is, again, if I have to really put another question, alternate question, it could be, how is India's nuclear exceptionalism delivering on the goals of non-proliferation? That's one framing we can do, right? So, right. And then second, there is second observation that I do have on the question, which is about South Asia. Now, we all know that we do not really appreciate the usage of the word South Asia, because it really dilutes our security imperatives, right? If you look as an Indian, if I'm looking at it from security strategy lens, then I want to, then appropriate regional appropriation would be Southern Asia, right? Which obviously brings in the China factor. And of course, any discussion on nuclear cannot take place without China. And we have seen our three speakers, all three of them have mentioned China, in their own respective areas. So I think to speak about the regional geography is also very important, and Southern Asia. So that's one angle which is also very important. Now, coming to India's unique position with the NPT, right? Now, obviously, it's very well known. We remain outside of the treaty. We also do not accept any obligations arising out of the treaties that we are not signatory to or we have ratified. That's the legal understanding. But we are we are a country with nuclear weapons, and we remain outside. And our policies have been consistent with the larger goal of the NPT, that is also non-proliferation. Now, of course, there are caveats, and we'll come to that later. Just saying that India's nuclear efforts are also consistent with, let's say, if you want to go article-wise, are really consistent with Article 1, Article 3, and Article 6 of the NPT. Article 1 obligates states not to transfer, right? So we are absolutely opposed to transferring or assisting nuclear technology and nuclear weapons to other countries. Article 3 deals with, of course, the grand bargain of nuclear energy and diversion of it into weapons of proliferation. And for that, you put in the safeguards. So we all know that India's civilian nuclear reactors are under IAEA safeguards after the US-India civilian nuclear deal. And effectively, we, since 2008, we have these safeguard regime put on us, right? Now, Article 6 is also on disarmament. And I don't think I have to really emphasize on our commitment to disarmament and kind of history that really can be substantiated as an evidence to how much we support disarmament, how we have actively contributed to the themes of general and complete disarmament, specifically at the UN as well, and the CD and other international forums, and that continues. So with regard to nuclear non-proliferation, there is a bit of history that I also want to point out, is that India has been very sympathetic to the cause of non-proliferation. And since early on, that is even before the NPT came into being, our position has always been that there is not going to be any trade of these weapons and no supply of them to the other countries. Now, this is very well documented. Our diplomats have presented country positions at the UN. And we even called in for the steps to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, but obviously India has also insisted that it is the nuclear powers, right? Which is, if you go back in the 1960s, this obviously means that nuclear powers, possessors of the nuclear weapons, those have the special responsibility to take this kind of initiative. We were not a nuclear weapons power in the 1960s, right? So, of course, in that support, in that context, we can also put in our support. We can build, situate our support to the Irish draft of the NPT. And particularly, I want to bring in two points here, which is the provision under which nuclear weapon state will not undertake and it will refrain from really relinquishing the control of nuclear weapons and transmitting the information. So not only the weapon, but the information, the wherewithal as well. And second aspect was on the states not possessing nuclear weapons. States possessing and not possessing nuclear weapons will also undertake not to manufacture or otherwise acquire. So this was basically addressing two theoretical problems that we now know of, which is vertical proliferation and horizontal proliferation, right? So we were very early on. We wanted to have an early treaty on the non-dissemination of nuclear weapons. Of course, a part of it was supported by the Irish draft, but our support to the Irish draft should not be looked at as an in toto complete support, because we had explained our support by arguing that we do not agree to the continued manufacture or retention of nuclear weapons by the existing nuclear weapon state, right? So our position has been very clear. Non-proliferation means horizontal and vertical as well. So the Irish Irish draft did not really address this issue. So we had obviously presented our views on that. On the non-proliferation angle, again, I want to also highlight, because India's non-proliferation position has always, should be viewed in relation to its larger disarmament goals. Because we started with this larger goal of disarmament, and over a period of time, we were also expecting that negotiations will be done in good faith. So non-proliferation was one of the collaterals that we were expecting the world, the international community, to make some progress on, right? So how do we now contribute to this larger goal of non-proliferation? There are various ways. Now I will start by, and just like one more minute on discussing norms. So why are norms important? See, one of the most important deliverables, one of the important ways in which non-proliferation is delivered is through these international norms. And the reason norms are important, because norms norms are the only norms have actually been tested by time. Norms are the most they are voluntary. Countries tend to deliver on these norms. It is the treaty that we have seen has some withdrawals and all. So norms are very important, and norms remain the strongest out of all the governance architecture that we have seen in non-proliferation. So the way we deliver our commitment is through IAEA, UNSC resolutions, participation in IAEA pledge of not diversing the peaceful program. There is UNSC resolutions that and I want to emphasize here the UNSC resolutions, not unilateral resolutions. There are also 1540 that we contribute to. Then there is another for domestic. We have a WMD Act, which has now taken the financing bit, also which is amended in 2022. So basically, India's delivery on non-proliferation can be viewed in two framing, which is us and which is for self, and then also for them, that is the global community. So I think that's a useful framing. There is one aspect I want to also mention on the universalization of the NPT. Right now, there was a lot of debate on how NPT should be universalized and things like that. And three particular instances, especially at the UN NPT ReviewCon 2000, there was one conversation by the US on around in 2009, especially by Rose Gautam, the Bureau of Secretary Arms Control State. Right before the NPT ReviewCon 2010, she had mentioned India by name, that India should adhere to NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. And there were some resonations of this universalization that had taken shape. Now, it's interesting to note that diplomacy has worked in such a way that this universalization calls have now died down. right? The current concerns of the non-proliferation regime and the non-proliferation order has now shifted to North Korea, Iran, and then nuclear sabotaging that we have heard, and I don't want to name any country. So those are some concerns that have come out. And if you know, the last review conference did not even result in a consensus document, right? So I think I'll leave it at that. And there are two more aspects that perhaps we can take up in the next round or something. So I'll thank you so much.
No problem. We can just continue with the 2 points that are left over for your next round. Since we are short on time, I hope to finish by 4:15. I will continue with my questions, and maybe we can just stick to 5 minutes per speaker, so that we can also have maybe at least 1 or 2 questions for the audience. Yeah, Dr. Sethi, you mentioned credible minimum deterrence. We discussed this before as well. Would you like to elaborate on India's doctrine of CMD and how it reacts to the conflict that we're facing currently and any other multi-theater conflict that might happen?
Thanks again, Shravishta, and really great comments by all my panelists. So when we talk about credible minimum deterrence, we are actually talking about the issue of numbers here. How much deters? And there have been different countries have reached different formulas to determine what deters for them. So we've had examples of China in the initial years after it tested its nuclear weapons, where Mao had said 6 are enough, and that was the minimalist model. And then you had at the same time in the 60s and the 70s, where the superpowers had gone up to like 50-60,000 nuclear weapons, and they felt they needed such large arsenals to deter. So really, what deters? That has been the central question. And India answered that question for itself by saying that what we will build will be credible at the minimum level. And really, the conjunction of these two words is very important to understand, because it has to be credible, but it will not go berserk like we saw the US and USSR do with a very large stockpile. We will stick to the minimum that is credible to cause unacceptable damage. Now, for this to work out, then, the understanding that India brought to the issue of numbers was, we are talking about a weapon of mass destruction. You would all remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one weapon of 10 kiloton, 15 kiloton on one city, and 80,000 people were vaporized. Today, we have a far better understanding of how do you target for maximum damage. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not intelligent targeting with nuclear weapons. And you also have densities of population in our part of the world, what Hina mentioned as Southern Asia, India, Pakistan, China, where the densities are so huge that even a small, by American or Soviet standards, even a small nuclear weapon would cause that kind of a damage. So India's understanding was, we don't need a large stockpile, we just need enough that can cause unacceptable damage. So the question then comes is, what is unacceptable damage? Because different countries will have different thresholds of how much they will take as damage. And for that, you have to do deep studies of your adversary to understand what would be unacceptable for them. The bigger problem that countries end up facing is that you mirror image. If you think that if this is not acceptable to me, it will not be acceptable to the other side. But that's not how we have seen unacceptability thresholds come up. They change over a period of time. When the country is more developed, your ability to take damage could be much lesser than if you are not developed. The political system, the value at stake, the historical experience of a nation, all of those are factors that go to determine what would be the unacceptability threshold. And based on that, you arrive at certain numbers. Karthik pointed out that, according to what is known in the public domain, India has about 170 nuclear warheads. The US has 1550 nuclear warheads, and the Americans are beginning to talk today about the two-body problem, because they feel they have to have enough to deter Russia and now also China. Besides, of course, North Korea. So, some of them have called it the multiple challenge that they have. India, when it acquired nuclear weapons, it was with a two-body problem right then. And yet we arrived at an understanding that we will get to what we think would be credible to be able to cause unacceptable damage to both sides. And because we don't believe in war fighting with nuclear weapons, it's a weapon to cause punishment to the other side, which is the purpose of that weapon. we have not been so fixated on numbers. So as you see, every year when some reports come out to suggest what the numbers are, India is seen to be sort of chugging along steadily with some 5, 6, 8 weapons being added to its arsenal every year. There's no panic, even if China is going up to 600 nuclear weapons from what American estimates tell us today. There is no panic in India that you have to expand your numbers quickly. So you are going at a certain pace with that understanding. I think the focus has to be more on survivability, because large arsenals don't necessarily equal to more deterrence. It's about signaling the survivability of your arsenal, which India has decided would be with deception, with dispersal. So they will be on different parts of the triad, going even to the sea, with mobility of our missiles rather than having just silos. So that's how we are looking at this whole issue of deterrence. And deterrence is more than just numbers. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. Dr. Singh, if I could redirect a different question to you on emerging technologies, autonomous weapons, and AI, and how this is contributing to nuclear decision making, primarily, especially for India. I'd love your comments on that.
Thanks, Shrishta. So I think, keeping in mind India's elaborate history with nuclear diplomacy that Dr. Hina described, with the advent of this new nuclear age and sort of a fusion with emerging technologies, I think India has a very unique and important position, wherein so essentially it has to strike a balance between vying for these emerging advanced technologies, which include, as I mentioned, both nuclear and non-nuclear strategic weapon systems. And at the same time, what it has to do is also reconcile with its long-lasting doctrine of no first use and its long-standing role for advocacy of disarmament, both general nuclear disarmament as well as general and complete disarmament. And this also then has to be seen together with something that Hina mentioned on India's position of being an outsider state, as far as the nuclear non-proliferation regime is concerned. Even today, strictly speaking, in terms of legal institutional context, India still, in many ways, still stands to be outside the nuclear non-proliferation regime. But what it also has to do, and it is actively doing, is asserting its potential for great power status. So these are some of the sort of aspects that India is looking at actively, but especially in the context of emerging technologies. Again, what we're seeing is a certain democratization of new technologies and a greater accessibility that has essentially opened new avenues for engagement and participation in a lot of these export control groups for countries like India, as well as other rising powers like South Africa and Brazil as well. And what is interesting is, unlike the Cold War, just to put things in a bit of context, when states like India were mere, observers or recipients of a nuclear order that was sort of being conceptualized in front of their own eyes, today India is not a mere bystander. It is a very active and equal stakeholder in shaping and influencing some of these, power shifts, including, flow of information and data and new technology. So India, I think, is again in a very advantageous position where it can benefit from this churn that we're seeing in the international order today. But having said that, I think one has to be very cautious when talking about, again, emerging disruptive technologies, because it does carry the risk of significantly altering threat perceptions, as Dr. Sethi also mentioned, especially for states that are in close geographical proximity. It increases the risk for inadvertent escalation as well as miscommunication. So I think what India will have to deal with is, building robust crisis stability measures, crisis management measures, which I think is in a lot of situations, crisis stability is the first casualty. With reduced decision-making times and compressed communication windows, especially when you look at a lot of these aspects in light of technology. And again, I just want to briefly mention Operation Sindoor here again, because that was really, as I mentioned, the live demonstration of deployment of electronic jamming and of radar systems and use of sophisticated drones, which has sort of presented a new set of challenges now. And many experts have also argued that this action reaction chain that followed as a result of deployment of some of these new technologies, what it has essentially done is sort of exacerbated this fog of war, and it has moved both countries slightly up the escalation ladder, wherein the next crisis may potentially begin from a slightly higher rung on the escalation ladder. So these are, again, some of the challenges that countries in Southern Asia will have to deal with. Just one last point. We talk a lot about bilateral escalation dynamics and also regional escalation and deterrence postures. But I think especially, again, in the advent of new technologies, these conversations need to be had at a global level. And what we're seeing today is a certain lax in regulation on emerging and disruptive technologies. But what is also interesting is, especially for, given the context, given the history, especially for rising powers such as India, who are in many ways today at par with, some of the great powers in exploring this new strategic landscape and sort of pushing the boundaries for technological development. Countries like India would not be as readily willing to accept constraints on acquisition of these new technologies, and especially if it allows them to sort of have and achieve power parity with their adversaries. So I think, again, the challenge would be to use these advanced technologies, but in a more restrained and calibrated manner, also keeping in mind India's resilient NFU posture. I'll stop there.
To turn to Karthik again, Karthik, you spoke significantly on how India has been responding to has been responding in Operation Sindoor, and has to deal with the balance between Pakistan and China. Can you elaborate on the defining features in India's nuclear strategy across maybe the next decade, or how you see India progressing in its nuclear strategy?
Would say that there would be more delivery capabilities in a number of areas, hypersonics. We will have potentially even an ALCM capability, that is an air launched cruise missile capability. And we will see range of our missiles also grow, especially the sea leg. It'll increase in the next decade because delivery capabilities are absolutely necessary, because we are not testing, so we cannot miniaturize. Although we've gone for MIRVs and we have tested a MIRV capability, but still we don't have that kind of test data that the P5 have, that is the recognized nuclear weapon states do. But India has settled for this, and it has continued with its moratorium that it announced following the 1998 nuclear tests, and we've stuck with that. So it's what more test data does do is that it helps you, develop more compact warheads, conserve fissile material, and it also allows you to sort of expand your arsenal and gives you that flexibility. That data gives you that flexibility to expand it. The problem is that we don't have that kind of data, but that's something that we've settled for. And also when we miniaturize based on the test data through hot testing, it also helps us develop warheads with different yields, and that helps our nuclear posture. It helps our capabilities. And overall our nuclear strategy. But that is one thing that we've got to bear in mind. I personally have already recommended that even if India did test again, resume it. I mean, it'll have to be sure that it gets the best bang for the buck. That is, it'll have to do it really well, because the last time we did it in 1998, it was a bit rushed, and eventually that thermonuclear test that we carried out, that we claim we carried out, actually fizzled out. But it was more because of haste. That I know from a lot of people. At least I know that from the late Santanam Santi. He said it was carried out with haste, and he did tell me that even personally. And he did say, and he has stated even publicly when he was alive. The point I'm trying to make is that if India does resume it, it better get it right, and it better distribute the testing period for over a year or so, because it cannot do it immediately and not rush into it, uh, and then agree to sign up and then sign up to the CTBT, if not ratify it, because sanctions are bound to ensue immediately after we test. So it'll undo many of the things that we've gained through the nuclear deal with the Americans, and it may even stall our nuclear civilian nuclear program. It would also stall uranium supplies to our and fuel supplies to our existing reactors. So there are things that it'll have consequences, but India will have to eventually settle for some form of arms control once it tests. That's how I see it. But anyway, but that's more hypothetical. That's theoretical. I don't believe the government is in a hurry or is rushed to move in that direction. Is rushing to move in that direction. But looking forward, I do believe delivery capabilities, improve your counter space systems. That would include what apart from EW, CW, which of course even CW would matter in your counter space systems, but microwave laser systems, and even a direct descent ASAT, at least a sea-based one, would also be can serve as a deterrent. But these are things that India should certainly keep in mind and bear in mind, apart from the others that I mentioned.
Thank you so much. Dr. Pandey, if you want to finish your points.
Just do a quick close comments if that's okay. And I'm going to, of course, take cue from what Shivani said, what Karthik said. And I'm so glad you all mentioned escalation dynamics, especially in the post-Sindoor era. And then Shivani also mentioned emerging tech and then crisis stability and all those implications. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to tie up all of this together and give in my closing thoughts on what is it that India should do, right? What more should we do? Because we are also meeting after the Sindoor operation, I think what really is important for us is to take hold and do a stock taking of what kind of narratives that are emerging out of the operations, especially which are conducive or non-conducive to our responsible nuclear imaging, right? Like if you just, because of course there was a lot of information warfare, misinformation that was going on, and wars these days are not just fought on battles but also on social media. So if you do a quick monitoring of social media, you will realize the kind of narratives that have come out from the other side, and those could possibly be very damaging to the reputation that we have of of being a nuclear responsible country, right? Not only that, these reputation and the perceptions also matter because they add to the crisis stability dynamics, like Shivani also brought out. So just to give you one example of what was really floating, there was some speculation on basically some kind of narrative that was there on social media about how India is actually, India is a country that is willing to risk its nuclear instability for the sake of its military and strategic goals, right? Because we have shown some willingness to strike some targets that were alleged nuclear targets and things like that. And so those are very dangerous perceptions that are building and they are floating. And those perceptions can then be deliberately utilized to, really erode erode the confidence in the non-proliferation community that India has really, acquired. So those kind of things are really important, and they again tie into the deterrence stability equations. So what is it that we should really do about these perceptions? We should, absolutely put out our narrative. I think the government of India has done a great job in coming out with evidence and proofs and a lot of press statements, and so there is obviously to topple all that misinformation that was happening. There was some official understanding that was portrayed, and it has been very well received. Now it is also about just the government narrative. Now, how does that tie into the conversation and the strategic discourse? And it is where think tanks and the contribution of think tanks really come in, right? We want to really talk about these crisis stability dynamics, and we want to write about this to really put forward our story as well, supported with theory, supported with evidence, and that will again tie into the positive reinformation of the nuclear imaging. That is one. What more India can also do is, I think we are doing a lot anyway in terms of non-proliferation. But what really we can do at the bilateral, I think Shivani also mentioned about great powers. We can always have dialogues about the non-proliferation. About non-proliferation with countries. Currently, if you go to MEA's website, you will know India has had disarmament dialogues with the UK, with South Korea, and France as well. I think it's an interesting space to have a conversation and iron out differences, forge shared understandings. We can do more track 1.5 to events, and especially on emerging tech, because that is one area which is not being spelled out, and that has potential to destabilize the crisis stability dynamics. That is one area we can always take up in bilateral dialogues, and also track 1.5 and think tanking sort of conversations, just to kind of really tone down the falsified anxieties that can really come up in the post Sindoor operation era. So I think we can do more outreach. There is one specific thing I think on NPT we can do, but I'm not sure if we should do it, because there is, of course, NPT is also marred by a lot of challenges. There is a problem of Article 10, which gives the right of countries to even withdraw if their security dynamics are jeopardized. So, nothing is really foolproof here, right? So can we look at these aspects as to when a country has given notice to withdraw from the NPT, what kind of mechanism can kick in to really stop that sort of, turning that country into a proliferation problem, right? So but because we're outside of the NPT, is it wise to really, and how our interests are going to be served, and will India's voice be heard on those issues because we are outside of it? So I think I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. We are within time, and luckily we managed to go within relative depth in the questions, even though I wanted to cover a lot superficially. So we do have time for, let's say, maybe 3 questions. Before you ask the questions, please give me your name, your affiliation, and who you're directing the question to as well. I'll take all 3 questions together, and then we'll answer the questions, yes? 3 questions, guys. Please decide. Okay, we'll take you 3. Actually, I do want 1. We'll take you, and you. Yeah.
I'm Manish Sharma. I'm working as a analyst. So my basic question is that we are finding that the things are getting complex with the Russia element also getting into, because it is also, collaborating as far as with nuclear reactor designs, fuel, components like, turbines, etc., for coolants with Pakistan and etc. So how will that, narrative change, because ultimately it will become a block of North Korea, etc., combining, and it won't work. It will work against India, So it's not China. Other point is that, we are finding that smaller countries are also coming in with their dual-use technology. For example, Israel, South Korea, etc., for smart grids, decarbonization element, as far as nuclear technology is concerned. So how will that play out? Because ultimately, it's not about having nuclear test. You can basically, even with nuclear dual-use technology, civilian use, you can basically very easily, transform it to what you call nuclear weapons, etc., for autonomous vehicles, drones, etc. So how will these smaller countries play out as far as nuclear domain is concerned? Yeah, thanks.
My name is Shlok Gupta, and I'm an intern here at ORF. My question is directed to Dr. Sethi, and it is regarding CMDs. So, when we were talking about it, you talked about the idea of mirroring or calculating it based on what could be perceived as potential unacceptable damage to that host country itself, right? Now, it's just a slight logical question of whether or not that could lead to maybe, I would phrase it as parallel exponential increase between countries. So if one country increases, let's say a country like the United States, right, increases it based on a certain calculation that they have done over a period of time, could potentially lead to other countries, maybe other counterparts, also increasing it to counteract the United States. So that parallel exponential increase would then eventually beat the purpose of the base minimum. So then would it make more sense to then either formalize or bureaucratize what the CMD is or get a third party involved to then mandate what it could be?
Good evening. My name is Kajal Sonkar. I'm a practicing advocate in Supreme Court and I'm specializing in human rights and international law. My question is for Dr. Pandey. Ma'am, you talked about universalization of NPT. It has largely failed because there have been signatories, non-signatories, including India. India has been very selective in picking in abiding by some terms of NPT, articles also that you mentioned. But considering that the universalization has failed and how much the non-signatories are liable under the customary and norms under public international law, how are they bound by that?
Okay, so those are three questions. The first one, maybe Karthik can go first, and Shivani, you can also elaborate on that after Karthik is done. The second to Dr. Sethi, and the third to Dr. Pandey.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can say that artificial intelligence, because of its advances, it's an emerging technology. But apart from that, because it's self-improving, especially generative AI, can help you out. Sort of miniaturize warheads. It helps you with simulations far better. It could obviate the need for hot testing. That's a plausible way of looking at it. But you have to remember also the wealth of data that comes with hot testing, which has been put in together into a database, because AI itself is based on a lot of data. It is data intensive. Countries like the US, Russia, they've conducted so many tests. They have this wealth of data. So they can conduct these simulations with far greater ease. But even the Chinese have conducted at least about 45 tests. They do have some test data. And it's possible they did conduct a test, at least in one of their nuclear test sites at Lopnor. In fact, there are reports, at least I remember going back to at least 2019-20, that they may have done it. But you have to remember the fact that they too are trying to refine their capabilities based on the data that they have, or they want more and they're testing more. And that's why hot testing at some level is really necessary when it comes to nuclear weapons. But I think India, it's a different matter altogether. It's a matter of policy. We've made a judgment and a call. Unless something cataclysmic happens, like the Chinese go in for a testing spree, the Pakistanis do something, maybe that would be the incentive for India to resume. But otherwise, there are very few compelling reasons as of now, at least from a policy standpoint, that I think India will not go ahead with the resumption of hot testing. Okay, that's where.
Yeah, I think I can, since Karthik has covered the strategic military aspect, just to highlight the civilian aspect of nuclear cooperation, as was mentioned in the question. So while Russia and Pakistan relationship might be concerning for India, I think that was the implication in the question. India, at the same time, has also made overtures as far as its civil nuclear cooperation with Russia is concerned. And just to remind everyone, recently India and Russia also agreed to a long-term uranium supply pact for one of India's nuclear power plants in Tamil Nadu. And in addition to that, Russia's sort of comfort with India's liability laws concerning the nuclear damages is a lot more relaxed, I would say, as compared to what we have witnessed in the India-US relationship. So, this is where I want to just briefly mention one of the points that I made in my initial remarks is how India can sort of play off these, supposed great powers in terms of extracting benefits for itself. Because while on one hand, a major bone of contention in further advancing India-US nuclear cooperation, even in the context of 2008 nuclear deal, has been India's, issues with the nuclear liability laws that it has. And recently, in the wake of US's sort of removing curbs on 3 of India's nuclear entities, there's also been a committee set up by the government, which is looking to amend its India's Atomic Energy Act and also tweak its, Civil Liability Nuclear Damages Act. To sort of, enable broader cooperation with both private and state actors, and expand its cooperation with other, powers, nuclear powers. So I think India is, from where I'm standing, I think India is doing a good job in terms of sort of balancing its interests as far as its civil nuclear goals are concerned. Again, we all know that when it comes to nuclear energy, India has a very stated goal of achieving 100 gigawatts of nuclear power by 2047. So it is actively making overtures in that domain. And I don't think Russia-Pakistan sort of cooperation in terms of at least the civil aspect of nuclear power is going to be much of a concern, because India has its own plans and objectives for cooperation with Russia in that sense. So, yeah.
Dr. Singh, Dr. Sethi.
I really wish we had more time. There is a lot here to unpack in all that was said, but just very quickly coming to the point that you made about I was talking about mirror imaging of assessment of damage so that you don't make that mistake of doing that, but you putting mirror imaging for capability build up. So one side builds up and the other side feels that they have to respond to that. We did see that happen during the Cold War between US and USSR and then Russia, largely because they were coming with the attitude of fighting a war. So they wanted escalation control and to be able to, achieve victory after fighting a nuclear war. So it was with that tendency of mirror imaging. So if one was building, the other had to build up. But India and China broke that way of thinking to say that you don't have to really mirror image what the other side is doing. So even if you are increasing, it's the role that I'm giving for the nuclear weapon and the way I'm going to practice deterrence that is going to determine the number for me. Not because you are increasing that I have to necessarily increase. So that's a different philosophy that we are bringing to the table with this. And the way that the US and USSR and Russia were able to break that was through the concept of arms control, where both of them then decided that, we're going to put a ceiling on the numbers because that is enough for doing unacceptable damage to each other and for establishing deterrence. So arms control, rather than a third party putting a ceiling on that, was how they managed to do it. Just 2 very quick points. One on testing. Karthik made a strong point about the need for more testing because India doesn't have enough data. Yes, we've conducted only 5 nuclear tests, the least that has been done by any country in the world. But I think from what I heard from Dr. Kakotkar and Dr. Chidambaram is that we have built up a database that gives us the confidence of building nuclear weapons in the range from 20 kilotons to 200 kilotons. And really that is more than enough for the deterrence. Deterrence, fortunately, is not about the use of the weapon. It's about not having to use the weapon through manipulation or perceptions. And whether the thermonuclear weapon was a fizzle or not, I mean, except for people inside the system, we will never know. But I don't think it's harming our deterrence in any form, given the densities of population that I mentioned to you. And I don't think anyone would take greater happiness from the fact that I died from a thermonuclear weapon versus a fission weapon. More testing might be desirable, but it's not essential for deterrence. And I don't think we'll ever have the luxury of having 1 year of open testing being allowed to us by anyone. So yes, the wish list is strong, but without it also, I think we are doing fine. And my last point was about deterring park terrorism. This had come up from one of our panelists to say that will what we've done with Op Sindoor be able to deter Pakistan's terrorism? Highly difficult to say that it will, because terrorism is such a low cost policy for Pakistan. It's not about the number of people that we killed on the other side in terms of terrorists. We've said that 100 terrorists were killed. Pakistan can very quickly substitute them with 500 terrorists, because it's so easy to do that kind of an exercise. So we are not going to be able to have that satisfaction that you would be able to deter terrorism through what we've done. Certainly, we've made a dent, and it'll have to be done again and again. And that's why, as the Prime Minister said, Op Sindoor is not a one-off thing. We've shown that this will be the new normal, and that for any act of terror that takes order to undercut not just the terror roots, but also the hand which is feeding those terrorist organizations. So when you are hitting at the credibility of the Pakistan armed forces, that's where you would be able to, deter terrorism. And besides the military strikes, you have to also look at your own, counterterrorism strategies, interdicting, better border fencing, better intelligence. All of that will also have to be built up along with it. Thanks, and sorry for having taken long.
Seconds on that law question, and I'm quite surprised as to why you asked me, considering you are the one who's studying law. So you're probably much more well equipped than me to answer the question. But I'll just start with the universalization debate. Now, then my idea was that the universalization of the NPT is actually died down, right? So the arguments about how we should tie in other countries that remain outside of the NPT are something that I don't see really going to come up, right? I think outside of the NPT there also exists a non-proliferation order, which can be maintained through initiatives, bilateral, initiatives, the international norms, and there is just a network of so much that's going on that really supports non-proliferation policy and non-proliferation in action. My second point on about this whole the law issue on, of course, you would know it better, the IHL implications, right? There is a reason why India is, a signatory and ratified the CWC and BWC, and the law debates are very well accounted for in those domains. Then there's also some current conversations that are happening at the GGE, and especially within the framework of the lethal autonomous weapons, when we are really looking at, understanding the implications of IHL, and there are 11 guiding principles that we have released, and India has actively participated in that, in that process. So I think law is very well, accommodated. Of course, I think the perception also differs when an IR person looks at policy making and then, tries to accommodate the law dimension. And when a legal experts look into the legal and finaries of these issues and then design the policy narrative. So those are very separate. They are not separate issues, but I think the requirement currently is to really have an international law perspective to the international relations as well. And that is something where we are really lacking. And I think what you brought out today was actually very important. And we have to create institutions that can look into from the framework of law and really fine tune further our policy actions. I think I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists for answering the questions, both mine and the audience's. Thank you so much to the audience for being here and asking such detailed questions as well. This has been a very enriching conversation considering the current dynamics, both theoretical and practical, that India is facing. I hope to see you at the next National Security Dialogue. Please join us for high tea in the next room. Thank you.